This tutorial was created for the University of Cincinnati libraries and will introduce key concepts in using primary and secondary sources.
Many academic courses, especially in disciplines like history, anthropology, sociology, and literature, ask you to use primary sources in your projects and assignments.
Even when you've heard this term before, actually using primary sources in your paper can seem complicated. To start with, what is a primary source?
How is it different from a secondary source? Why do I need to use primary sources? Finally, if primary sources are so important, why even use secondary sources? So let's start at the beginning and define what a primary source is.
Primary sources have many different formats: newspaper articles, diaries, radio ads, films, YouTube videos, government documents. The list is endless. What makes them primary sources isn't what they look like, but who made them. Individuals and groups who are contemporary to a time produce primary documents.
For now, let's take the example of a diary. Let's say it's the diary of a 16-year-old girl living in India during independence from Great Britain. This diary records the end of colonial rule, the partition, and everyday life. Historians, anthropologists, and political scientists can use this as a primary source, meaning they can read it as a first-hand account of the past. However, primary sources aren't only written during an event. Let's say our diary is by the same person writing 20 years later, now a grown woman. She is reflecting on events she witnessed. For a scholar of Indian independence, this would still be a primary source, even though it's written significantly later. Her first-hand knowledge is what makes this a primary source. While both of these diaries are invaluable to a researcher, primary sources, especially when recorded many years later, should always be approached with caution. Careful scholars recognize that everyone has a bias, even when recording facts. In this example, the diary's author may be particularly proud of the events she witnessed. Alternatively, she may have developed negative feelings about them based on her later experiences. Even the most black and white account has a limited point of view that researchers must consider when citing it. Next, we'll ask, how are primary sources different from secondary sources? Secondary sources, like primary sources, can generally be identified by their format. A scholarly book called a monograph is a secondary source. Journal articles, documentary films, infographics, and biographies are also secondary sources. All of these types of documents are examining past occurrences. Like you when you sit down to write your paper, the scholars and research teams that created these documents are collecting primary sources and using them to create an impression and an interpretation of the past. So, now that we better understand what a primary source is, let's consider why it is so central to scholarship about the past. As we discussed before, historians and other scholars use primary sources to understand events or eras and contemporary reactions to them. The reasons are pretty straightforward. If you're writing about a particular time period, you should study evidence left behind by people from that time period and not just the writing of scholars far away and long after the fact. So, for the author of a monograph titled A History of Indian Independence, the woman's diary from the previous example will be enlightening, but also one of many sources used to paint a picture of that time period. This author may also use newsreels from the time, colonial government documents, local newspaper articles, recordings of radio transmissions, and even YouTube videos of digitized content from the 1940s. Each of these documents supports an interpretation of events that have already been closely studied. In the same way, you use primary sources in your course papers to establish the mood of the people in the past, cite evidence for a particular set of events, or show what information people in a given time period possessed. Doing this adds credibility to your work. Credibility gives you more than a better grade. It establishes your arguments in a way that brings them to the level of scholarship. As you have discovered, primary sources are vital to thorough research about the past. So you may be asking, how do secondary sources fit into my work? If primary sources are so important, why even use secondary ones? Scholars work hard and spend a lot of time in the archives doing research. They sift through mountains of primary sources to get full and nuanced understandings of the past. But history isn't simply written by a single individual at a desk in a bubble. Try thinking of historical scholarship as a cocktail party. In studying history, you are actually joining a conversation. You will discover that even when talking about the same document, scholars can have significantly different interpretations. At first, you will probably just be listening to what's being said, but eventually you will start contributing to the conversation. By referencing secondary sources in your papers, you are acknowledging how those who came before you understood a topic. You will then either build on that argument or contrast it with your own interpretation. Either way, you are acknowledging the larger conversation of your discipline.